series of lectures. We are thrilled to be joined this evening by Maya Forstater. Maya is a researcher and writer on topics related to public policy, tax, and business, and she recently founded the organization Sex Matters. She was, until December 2018, a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development. Her contract was not renewed due to publicly expressed gender-critical beliefs. She challenged this before an employment tribunal on the basis that her view of sex as a biological fact rather than a feeling or identity constituted a philosophical belief on the basis of which the center unlawfully discriminated. Employment judge Mr. James Taylor denied that these views constituted a protected philosophical belief on the basis that they were, quote, incompatible with the human dignity and fundamental rights of others, end quote. In particular, due to what he called their absolutist nature. That is, her view that sex is a biological fact was absolutist because that view persisted even when an individual possessed a gender recognition certificate. In addition, she stated in respect of Councillor Gregor Murray, a man who identifies as non-binary, the following, quote, I reserve the right to use the pronouns he and him to refer to male people. While I may choose to use alternative pronouns as a courtesy, no one has the right to compel others to make statements that they do not believe, end quote. This, Mr. Taylor concluded, was an absolutist view and one which was not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Maya has appealed against the judgment, which will be heard in just under a month's time. As Jodie Ginsberg, the then chief executive of the Index on Censorship said, quote, I cannot see that Maya has done anything wrong other than express an opinion that many feminists share, that there should be a public and open debate about the distinction between sex and gender, end quote. Needless to say, we agree. And to that end, we are thrilled to hear from Maya this evening, who will be presenting her lecture titled simply Sex Matters. This lecture feels particularly pertinent today as the Polish Parliament is voting on whether to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women, due to it clashing with conservative politicians' opposition to same-sex marriage and abortion. Women in Poland are fighting hard for their sex-based rights in 2021, which I think is an important reminder that women's liberties under law are not things to be taken for granted. So we stand in solidarity with those women. Following this lecture, there will be time for a Q&A. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can submit your questions during the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Those of you who are watching on YouTube can use the live comment function, and Sophie will be monitoring that page for questions as you submit them. Please note that any comments posted on YouTube are public, so you might want to bear that in mind in deciding whether to post any personal details. Just like last week, we asked everyone using the Zoom chat to just be respectful of each other, and otherwise you might be removed from the Zoom. And for those that use Twitter, Phoebe will be live tweeting on there. Our hashtag is imaginatively CamRadFems, and we invite you to use that hashtag as well. Finally, if anyone's experiencing any tech issues, please flag that in the chat, and Mary from Object will directly message you and try to help the best that she can. But without further ado, Maya, when you are ready.
Thank you, Imogen. Let me share my screen. So you can hear me, right? Yep, okay. So when I think Phoebe and then Imogen, I got lots of requests to do this. And I thought, you know, I'm not an academic, I'm not even a rad fem. You sure you want me? And they said, yes, we definitely want you. So I'm here, and I'm really pleased to be here, especially with everything that you know, kind of younger people and students are standing up to in terms of the pressure not to speak about this is intense. And I don't know if I could have done it when I was your age. So I have greatest respect for you. And so I'm going to talk about three things. One, my story, which people may have heard several times, so I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Two, about Sex Matters, the organisation, and what we're doing. And then three, some possibly provocative thoughts about why I'm not a rad fem, and what I think this current battle leads us to have to think about in terms of feminism and how we think about men and women. So those are kind of the three things that I'm going to talk about. So we launched Sex Matters on the 6th of March or thereabouts, or just before International Women's Day this year. It's a single issue campaign to bring back clarity on sex in law and policy and culture. And this is our strapline: that sex matters and it shouldn't take courage to say so. And I learned that it does. And I really didn't realize how controversial it would be when I started talking about this. And I certainly didn't kind of plan the route that I went down in terms of my employment tribunal and becoming a test case for this. But I have, you know, I'm kind of the tip of the iceberg of women who are being targeted at work, in academia, in schools, in societies, in, you know, Girl Guides and Scouting and every institution for saying that sex matters. So this little graph at the bottom is not my stress levels, but it sort of looks like it actually is my stress levels. This is my life in 7 tweets, and those are my Twitter followers along the bottom. So this is what happened. I was sort of going along at the beginning of the graph is I had about 2,000 followers. I worked at a policy think tank. I tweeted about policy questions, and I had followers who were happy to engage in arguments and disagreements without taking offense. And I didn't work on sex and gender, but I am a feminist. I had previously founded or co-founded Let Toys Be Toys, which was a Mumsnet, a campaign that started on Mumsnet. And I've been following the debate on sex and gender as it kind of came out in Twitter and came out in the media over the past year, coming up to September 2018, which was just coming up to the end of the government's consultation on gender self-ID. And I had been following it and trying to understand the issues and not saying anything because I didn't know whether I understood it well enough, whether I was sure of what I thought, and whether I could, you know, what the response would be. But as it came towards the end of that consultation and I could see other women being attacked and harassed for speaking up, I thought, well, they're brave, I should be brave too. And so I wrote this tweet, which is the most boring tweet. It was so careful, it took me ages to write it, that I will not cause offense. I'm just going to say there is this government consultation and we should be able to talk about this. So that was in September 2018. And nobody responded to that tweet. And I tweeted several things after that. I tweeted about Karen White, the trans woman in a women's prison. I tweeted things that were going on in the news and got no response. And so then I tweeted this question, which was a direct question to my followers. Men in international development and think tank world, a lot of them have taken this pledge not to be on a panel that's all male, to say to the organizers, can you get a woman? And so I asked them, if you were on a panel with Pips, Philip Bunce, a male banker who comes to work sometimes in a dress and who had been awarded this FT, Top Women in Business, would you say, no, sorry, that's still a manel, you need to get a woman? And so I asked that question, and it was a direct question to my followers, and that got some about 200 tweets in the end. A sort of conversation kicked off, and what I didn't know at the time was that also sort of set off red lights in the headquarters of the organization I worked for, which eventually led to me losing my job in March 2019. And this was actually the tweet that changed my life, which is where I tweeted as part of that thread that I'd lost my job. And I didn't know, but there were feminist lawyers who were looking out for a test case, and I became that test case. So then in May 2019, I launched Crowdfunder, and you can see there's a sort of blip in the graph there where I went from 2,000 to 6,000 followers, which felt quite big at the time, you know, from being somebody who was completely private to being in the newspapers and having a, you know, a public profile and people liking and hating me at that scale. And so that was, we prepared the case, we raised the money, and then I lost in December 2019, and then the day after J.K. Rowling tweeted about me, and then all hell broke loose, and you sort of know the rest of that story. And then there's a final little blip there, which is where J.K. Rowling, you know, kept tweeting about this and kept writing about this, and I think has changed the course of history. And obviously my story is just one of hundreds, I think hundreds and thousands of people who've been disciplined at work or who are scared to speak up. And so at the same time, over the past 3 years, there's been this quite amazing, I think, fight back and development of new grassroots organizations challenging gender ideology. And some of them are focused on specific issues, specific areas of the country. Some are coming from the left, some are coming from the right. Some are focused on lesbian, gay and bisexual people's rights. Mumsnet obviously has been a huge site of debate and organizing. But we thought there needed to be another organization. We thought there needed to be an organization that's for everyone, because sex matters for everyone. It matters for women and men. It doesn't matter what your politics are. It doesn't matter if you're religious or not religious. It doesn't matter if you're a feminist or not. Underlying all of this, there is a material reality of sex. And if all of the debates about other things can't happen unless we're able to talk about reality. And so we wanted to start Sex Matters as something that can support all of the other groups, that can work with them, but that can be that sort of lowest common denominator of, we need to be able to talk about reality in order to be able to negotiate our rights, and in order to be able to understand patterns and understand the world. So that is Sex Matters. Our aim is to re-establish that sex matters in law, policy, language, and culture. And we've got 3 goals. One is single sex services. This is sort of the practical end of where sex matters often in law is about single sex services, ranging from everyday services, toilets, changing rooms, showers, dormitories, to more specialist women's services like women's refuges, rape crisis, enabling people to speak up, particularly in work, and then making the wider debate possible. And we've set kind of 4, the principles are really basic. As I said, we've tried to think about what are the lowest common denominator between for everyone who thinks this matters. It relies on human rights, it relies on science, it relies on reality and clarity, but it doesn't rely on having shared beliefs in anything else. So what is sex? I think you probably all know this, but my belief that I went to the tribunal with is that sex is binary, immutable, and important, and that it relates to, do you have the kind of body that is made to make large gametes or small gametes, egg or sperm, that very basic thing. And the judge said I was wrong about that, but that wasn't what I lost on. What I lost on was that saying that was seen as not worthy of respect in a democratic country, or a democratic society, which is odd because all of our laws are based on sex being binary and immutable and sometimes important. And the problem is that those laws have been misrepresented and misapplied in policy. And so we think the problem is largely not with the laws, but with the way that they're translated into policy, and the way that they've been miscommunicated, and organisations are adopting Stonewall law rather than the actual law. So sex matters across lots of different parts of society, and people have different reasons for coming into this. Some people come into this because of sport, some people come into this because of schools and safeguarding, some people come into it because of statistics or because of particular areas like prisons, and then obviously workplace equality, and protections against sex discrimination. You can't have those if you can't talk about what sex is. So we think we need to work across all of these different areas, and ultimately they're all connected. If you can't say what a man or a woman is in a hospital, how does that change in a prison? How does that change in a school? How does that change in a relationship, in defining what it means to be straight or to be gay? And underlying this, I think, for me, is democracy. How can you have laws that you can't speak, that you can't talk about? That, for me, is the bottom line. Other people have other bottom lines. Some people have a bottom line that is about patriarchy, about feminism. Some people have a bottom line that is about their religion. People have different fundamental beliefs, and ultimately they need to be able to work together. They need to be able to live together in society. And if we can't talk about reality, then how can we do that? So that's, that's what I mean by sex matters being a lowest common denominator. And we know that sex really, really matters. So this is just one bit of data in terms of statistics on crime, that the majority of violent crimes and the vast majority of sex offences are undertaken by males. And so in 2004, this clear law about there being two sexes, sex sometimes matters, sex matters in prisons, sex matters in healthcare, sex matters in safeguarding, was changed through the Gender Recognition Act, which was thought to only apply to a very small number of people. So they thought about 5,000 people at the time, and it's turned out about, I think it's about 6,000 now, people have applied for a gender recognition certificate and are able to change their legal sex. And that was thought of as being a very specific accommodation for a very small group of people. But now we're told that 500,000 people are gender variant, and most of those people haven't undergone surgery, don't have diagnosis. They're a quite different group of people from the original group of people, and those group also want the same rights. And the question is, what are those rights and how do they impact on other people? And this is playing out in, all of these different fault lines in women's prisons, in being able to ask for a female doctor, and being assured that you're going to get one, in gyms and changing rooms, in women's sports, in the data that governments collect on us and our ability to have reliable data on ourselves, let alone other people. And underlying this is policy capture of all of our government institutions that have changed sex to gender in all of their policies, in all of their data, and in their culture, because they're being trained by, advised by, and rated by the set of organisations that are pushing this, particularly Stonewall, which has 250 government organisations signed up to the Stonewall Diversity Champion Scheme. They say they cover a quarter of employees work for organisations that are covered by the Stonewall Diversity Scheme. So their employer has made themselves accountable to Stonewall and to Stonewall's interpretation of the law rather than to the actual law. And obviously that has a huge impact if you're working in an organisation where the rules are set by Stonewall, then you can't speak freely and you're fearful for your job if you're gender critical. So Sex Matters will do sort of these 4 things, or these are the 4 things that we think need to be done to solve this. One is to advocate for clarity in the law, and there's 2 parts of that. What we see happening is that the proposal for gender self-ID was defeated largely by women fighting back, making their voices heard, making the evidence heard. And at the moment, the UK government is not going forward with gender self-ID. But what we're seeing is that gender is being pushed into law everywhere, into hate crimes, into maternity law, into every area of policy that you can think of. There's a line about gender. And so there's the reactive piece about pushing back against that. And then there's a proactive piece about thinking, how can we amend and clarify the laws to make sure that everyone's human rights are protected, but that sex is clear. Secondly is to publish usable guidance, because all of the guidance coming out of government institutions and official organisations at the moment is misleading about sex and gender and about sex-based rights. And organisations, schools, universities are adopting guidance coming out of Stonewall, coming out of gendered intelligence, and we need to be able to put forward alternatives to that for employers. Thirdly is to support people, to mobilise people to speak up and take action. And then fourthly is to expose and challenge the institutional capture. So that's what we are going to be doing. That is Sex Matters. And so those are the 4 founders. It's myself, Rebecca Bull and Naomi Cunningham, who are lawyers, and Emma Hilton, who's a scientist. There are several other people in the advisory group, and we're starting to build up volunteers and a mailing list, and please join it. And then I sort of promised to be, how are we doing for time? I promised to be a little bit provocative, which was to say, I think when this battle is won, and I think it will be won, I think we will look back in future and say, that was a crazy time when people thought that sex didn't matter or sex wasn't real, and where they were telling children that if they played with the wrong toys, they might be born in the wrong body. I think we will look back and think that was madness. But I think we will also look back and think, what does it mean to say that sex matters? And I think we've got very good at arguing that sex matters below the neck, that there are differences in strength, there's differences in athletic performance, there are obviously reproductive differences, but we're very resistant to talking about differences above the neck, average differences between men and women in behavior and cognition. And if you look back at those prison statistics and the violence statistics, there is, I watched Julie Bindle's lecture a couple of weeks ago, which was brilliant, and I love Julie Bindle, but the assertion that none of this is natural and none of this is innate, I think is partly what led us down the route of ending up saying sex isn't real, sex doesn't matter. And if we think that human beings evolved into quite distinct sexes and that their bodies are quite different, I think we need to recognize that there are also evolutionary pressures on minds. And what does that mean for how things have turned out in society? And then obviously the pushback on that is, you're a biological essentialist and you're trying to uphold traditional gender norms. I think we have to find a way of getting beyond that dichotomy to thinking about, you know, what are the overlaps, or how do the differences between patterns of males and females translate into patterns of inequality in society? How can we challenge and remedy those patterns without denying that biology exists, and that relates both to bodies and to minds? I think that's going to be the challenge. But I think, you know, in the short term, I'm focused on clarifying sex in law, and I think that's something that can be done by people with quite different beliefs about what is a good life or what is the meaning of life. And then I was thinking, this is what I've been thinking about as I sort of do my daily lockdown walk. So the picture on the left is St Albans Cathedral. That's where I live, and I walk around the. I'm not religious. So I walk around the outside of the cathedral every day, and obviously the middle one is Cambridge, where you are, and the one on the right is Parliament. And you know, these are all institutions that have been established to articulate rules for living, and how systems of knowledge and systems of collaboration, and the idea of what a good life is. Underlying all of that is the basic reality that we are apes living on a rock. And I think all of our institutions have always told stories about what it means to be human that have abstracted from the biological reality, because the biological reality doesn't tell you how to live, but it tells you why we developed in the way that we did. So there's always a disjunction between the stories that institutions tell about themselves and biology. And I think it's into that gap that you know, this story that people can be born in the wrong body, or that people can change sex by saying words, or that sex doesn't matter, has you know, has come into that gap between the stories we tell about our institutions and biology. And there will always be that gap, and so we need to understand it and understand how vulnerable our institutions are and what's important in them. So that is Sex Matters.
Really interesting talk. We've received quite. My apologies to anyone if we're unable to read out your question. If you do want to submit any other questions, please try and submit them in a sort of a question format. It just makes it a lot easier than, you know, reading out a comment. That can be tough. Okay, to set us off, she has said that she will work with all mainstream political parties to fight gender ideology. Does she get frustrated, as I do, with some on the left who tend to believe that only the left should save us?
I think it's kind of each to their own. I mean, I think it's important that there are people on the left who are working with the left and who are doing that. I think it's important that there are people on the right who are working with their constituencies. So I don't get, like, not everybody has to do everything at the same time. So I don't get frustrated with people who see their role as working on the left. I don't think the left will save us on its own, but I think if you think that that's the place where you can make the most difference and that's most important to you, then I think you should do that. You know, similarly, people can focus on academia or on healthcare or on the piece of the puzzle that is most important to them and where they can make most of a difference. And I think the reality is none of those will solve it on their own.
Okay. A question from Fiona Wilton. Maya, what motivates you and how have you stayed resilient in the face of disappointment, frustration, and abuse? And she adds, thank you.
I'm just bullheaded and just, I think, anger and not giving in to the anger. And the thing that's disappointed me most has been seeing how much this has corroded institutions that matter, and people who are supposed to be in charge of safeguarding and in charge of fairness and in charge of human rights, and sort of every institution that you push into, you find that they have great mission statements, and below that it gets very mushy very quickly, and it's that that's motivated me, that I think we can't do without those institutions. We can't say they're all rubbish, let me just get on with gardening or whatever, because we need those institutions. And yeah, I think this, I don't know if this had happened to me when I was your age, I don't know if I would have stood up to it in the same way, but it happened to me when I was in a time in my life where I could, and I couldn't see that I could back down from it. Once you sort of pull back the curtain and see how much this has corroded the integrity of organizations, I think I couldn't turn away from it.
Okay, so we've got quite a few questions about this. So you notice that there is the question of evolutionary pressures on the minds of men and women, and that denying this fact, you said, is part of what has led to this idea that sex doesn't matter. But I also wonder if partly this kind of thinking has also kind of led to the opposite effect, that often many people, particularly in my experience, men, reach this conclusion that they must be a member of the opposite sex because of their, because they are told that men are like this and I'm not like this, and therefore I must be sort of in the wrong body, quote unquote. One question put like in this term, actually, this is Sophie, behavioral and cognitive sex differences between men and women. How can we investigate these without falling into sexist and deterministic assumptions?
I think just by being careful about not falling into sexist and deterministic assumptions, but also not hiving off any area of human knowledge and saying we can't investigate that because we might not like the conclusions from it. And I think that is how we sort of ended up going down this track. What was the first part of the question? It was a long question.
Oh, sorry, it was more of a ramble. Well, I was just saying that I feel like sometimes this sort of question can pull in two directions. That sometimes it leads us to want to say that yes, sex doesn't matter, but then often it can sort of maybe lead people to the perverse conclusion that therefore, because I know sex matters so much, that must mean that sex means whatever my personality is.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that there is no mechanism where you can have the wrong brain. Your brain is your brain, and if your brain, if your natural tendency is to be, a man who is more feminine or a woman who's more masculine, or that's part of the variety of life, and I think this idea of brains being in the wrong body is just a non-starter.
So different kind of topic. How can we challenge institutional capture? So for many students at Cambridge and at universities elsewhere, we're applying for jobs with organizations that publicly tout their associations with Stonewall, for example. And it seems like it's often sort of we're fighting a bit of a losing battle because companies believe that they benefit from their association with Stonewall and vice versa. So what's the best way that normal people, particularly students, might sort of approach activism, this kind of activism, and trying to break that kind of codependent relationship?
I mean, that it's really difficult. It's really difficult, which is why the grip of these organizations has been so strong. It's really difficult when you're coming into an organization, when you're early in your career, or you're trying to get a foothold in an organization to challenge what they're doing. I think, the more that we can use the law, the more that we can clarify the law so that people can say, this is not just me, this is not a strange something particular that I'm pushing. This is just the law. There are 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act. Why does your equality monitoring statement not consider sex? The more that we can push clarity in the law and allow people to use that, I think that gives at least hopefully some safety. I hope also, so my case is going to appeal at the end of April, which is to try and demonstrate that believing that sex is real and immutable, is a belief that's protected in the Equality Act. And we hope also that that will give protection to other people who are facing challenges at work. But when, my email box is often full of people saying, what should I do? And I don't often say, go in hell for leather, because the truth is it is risky, and if you can't afford to be cancelled, if you can't afford to take that risk, then you have to be careful, I think, which is a terrible thing to say, but I think it is the truth. But I think the more that we can have use the law to protect women's rights and to protect sex-based rights, then the easier it will become for people to speak up in their workplace. But I definitely wouldn't sort of berate anybody for being anonymous on Twitter, or for sort of being cautious in their own life, because people have different things to lose.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of specific questions from people who sort of are in a situation where they feel in conflict with their own organization. So I've got one question here from someone who says, I work as a mental health support worker in the NHS. The policy capture is immense. And she goes, I want to speak up, but I feel lost in such a big institution. And we've got another question from someone who says, I work in HR policy at a prominent university. Can Maya advise on how I can help resist the dominance of Stonewall? And I've already come to blows. So I guess you've sort of already addressed that. Do you think that perhaps, I mean, is it advisable at this point to ask people to maybe just wait to see what the outcome of your appeal is before they do anything?
Well, hopefully that will be soon, although it could go on to other courts. I think one thing that can be really powerful, and we've seen it in academia and some other sectors, is people starting to find themselves, find the other people who agree with them, and sort of organize within a sector. And that's quite difficult, because as soon as you raise your head, you become a target of attack. But I've heard of people starting to talk about the issue where it comes up in equality policies, or where it comes up in International Women's Day in their organization and so on, and doing it quite cautiously, but then finding people in their sector. And one of the things that we want to start to do is to convene and connect people in different sectors, because I think in any organization there are people who know about this and who are concerned about this, but who are quiet and who don't know who the other people are. And then there's a bulk of people who don't know, probably don't care very much, but if they were asked, would also say they understand what the two sexes are. You know, they just haven't been following closely. And then there's a smaller group that is pushing gender ideology, and they're much more visible, much more vocal, and they can use all of the disciplinary processes of the organization. So the you know, the battle is not even, but the more that we can connect people who are thinking about this and help them to find each other, I think that can be quite powerful.
Perfect. So next question I have is, I fear the law will change and female sex, quote unquote, will change definition to essentially become meaningless or no longer protect women as a sex. Do you share that concern?
I do, but I think we're winning more than we're losing recently. And I think the way this has happened has been undercover. It's happened through backroom dealings between trans activists and civil servants and politicians. It's not this has never been put to the electorate. It's all been done quietly. And once you bring it out into the open through court cases or through debates in Parliament and into the media and into academic research and into books and into all the normal places where you would deal with this stuff, I think then we win. You know, when it was no debate, things were getting pushed through. But once we bring it out into the open, I think we win. And we, you know, you saw this with the ONS case on the census, where the ONS underestimated the concern of women, overestimated the power of the trans activists, and went with the trans activists. And, you know, I think they were quite surprised that women could raise 100K in 3 days and bring a case and bring them to court. And then they had to justify what was a completely incoherent policy. And if they'd had to develop that policy through the normal channels of quality impact assessment and sort of subjecting it to normal analysis, it never would have gotten as far as it had. And I think every policy that comes up now where they're trying to push gender quietly or trying to push self-ID quietly is now vulnerable to this kind of challenge. And so I am concerned, but I'm sort of a little optimistic that we can change something. And I think it's very specific to the UK that we have done this, and it has come from the left, and it has come from feminists and radical feminists that have organized to do this in ways that I don't think any other country has quite done that at this point. And so it's really important that we push it, I think, and that we expose it to sunlight and to democratic scrutiny, because if we can show that this stuff can be unpicked, then hopefully that can help others in other countries.
Someone just said hashtag Turf Island.
Yes, exactly. Here we are.
So a sort of follow-up question, again by Fiona English. Great questions, Fiona. The recent pushback, particularly in the House of Lords, on the use of pregnant person in the maternity rights bill, has shown that it's possible to stop the erosion of women's visibility and words. do you have any advice on how we can influence the debate in Parliament and relevant subcommittees and politicians? Just as sort of to tack onto that, I note your enthusiasm. I think overall I share it, but I also remember there was an MP whose name I actually can't remember, who recently sort of was lauded on Twitter because he told TERFs to F off or whatever is, however it was phrased. So it does sort of feel like there is still this element even in Parliament which feels that they get a political benefit out of being abusive to this aspect of political opinion. So do you think that trying to influence our local MPs and so on is a good way to go, a good way to achieve?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think we should remember that Twitter is not life. Twitter is not the electorate. It's a very slim slice of the electorate, and it has over influence. This stuff doesn't play well on the doorstep, even where people are not specifically concerned about this issue. They don't like the excesses of it. So the idea that somebody with a penis can be in a women's changing room, in a women's shower with women and girls, is not accepted by the electorate. And the idea that you have to be a TERF or radical feminist or some kind of special group to object to that, I think is not the reality. It's the reality on Twitter, but in constituencies it's not. And I think it is important that we mobilize and that we get people talking to their MPs. It's really important, and it's important that we get the evidence to them, but it's also important that they hear, I think, how this is affecting people's lives and kind of the emotional side. I think we do have to win hearts and minds as well as rationality and evidence, and it is affecting people's lives. It is affecting women and girls. It's affecting girls' careers. It will women's careers. It will affect women in sport. And often I think MPs are a combination of scared because they see the kind of response that the likes of Rosie Duffield has had, and that she hasn't been supported and backed up by Keir Starmer. Some are sort of bought into the ideology. Some are distracted and they're thinking about 100 different things, which is understandable, and they are influenced by people and emotions. So somebody sitting in front of them and telling them what this means to them and how this is affecting their life does have an influence on them in the almost as importantly as kind of data and statistics. So I think it's really important to make those connections with your local MP, even if they're not very open to it, as mine isn't. But we keep trying to meet her.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, what do you think, if you could pick one, what is the number one priority for sex matters? So are you happy with the legal framework as it exists, or is the main problem the policies and practices of public authorities or private companies? What do you think should be sort of the key number one priority if you were to pick one?
I think we can get a long way with the current laws. I think the current law is not bad. It recognizes that sex is a protected characteristic and gender reassignment is a protected characteristic, and those are two separate protected characteristics, and it provides for single sex services in a wide variety of situations. I think the biggest priority is that has been misrepresented, and so being able to use that law and being able to enforce it, I just think that that's the sort of 80-20 of how we solve this is in the first place using the laws that we have. I think there may be other places where we need to clarify or change bits of the law, but there's lots that's just been misrepresented or not being used, and so the single sex exceptions in the Equality Act, which apply across schools, hospitals, prisons, charities, so women's charities, workplace, changing rooms, toilets, all of that kind of thing. It covers so many areas of life, and there's so much misrepresentation of it. And if you look at what that law actually says, it says that you can have a single sex service where a person can object, a reasonable person can object to the presence of a member of the opposite sex. So it's a very low bar for why you should be allowed to have a single sex service. It's not about risk of, it's not about proving that someone is going to attack you or that they're a safety risk. It's not about defending the most vulnerable women. It's not about having to disclose histories of trauma. It's about really everyday situations where people can object to being surprised by a member of the opposite sex. And I think if we can kind of push back to those laws, then that then helps to protect all of the other stuff, the vulnerable women, the specialist services, because we shouldn't be having to negotiate at that point. It should be a much clearer expectation that there are rules in society to protect men and women, and everyone needs to follow those rules.
Great, thanks. The next question is from someone called Tortoise119 on YouTube. He or she says, I would love Maya to expand on this idea of the gap, quote unquote, between institutional ideologies and biological realities. How is it that extreme gender ideology has filled the gap, and why now? And if I could just tack on my own question. What do you think the difference is between this issue, gender ideology, if that's sort of how we want to call it, and so many other, I guess you could say, causes with some progressive energy behind them? It seems like this debate has been attended to by an unusual degree of, I guess you could say, a sort of totalitarian impulse, like this desire to make someone, force someone else to believe, the right, quote unquote, view. Do you think that that's correct, that it is an unusual example of this sort of totalitarian impulse, or am I maybe missing other things because I'm not on the wrong side of them?
I think it's quite a usual example. I mean, I think we can, we look at the Cultural Revolution in China, or the witch hunts, or all of those kind of examples through history of how people have turned on each other and used fear and used mythologies to victimize people. I think it's sort of exactly the same. So I think it is quite usual, and I'm sure if you are on the other side of this, we know that there are people being cancelled for things that you probably disagree with them strongly. My appreciation of freedom of speech has gone way up from being kind of found to be on the wrong side of history, and it's made me think again about about people whose views I would have been less concerned about their freedom of speech because I didn't know them, I didn't agree with them, and so when I'm thinking about why are people not standing up for me, I do think about who did I not stand up for because I didn't agree with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as kind of apes on a rock, building these cathedrals of kind of knowledge and material, our institutions are the way that we collaborate. They're the way that we create knowledge. They're the way that we create wealth, and anything that creates wealth then creates incentives for people to capture that wealth and capture that power. And so every institution that creates wealth is vulnerable to being captured by people who are more willing to exploit biology. So I think, you know, in order to create collaborative institutions, we, you know, we make stories about what society is, that society is fair, that we have rules, that we follow rules, and we know that in reality people don't, and that people are motivated by you know, getting off with each other, you know, all, you know, so you go to university and on one hand it's supposed to be all about learning and you know, these higher things, but on the other hand it's about, you know, who's falling out with who, and who's getting off with who, and all of that much more human stuff that's taking place within these institutions that are built on kind of higher principles. And that's true at every level. You know, it's true at the highest levels of these institutions, and they have kind of, in order to operate day to day, we pretend that we're not you know, that we're not animals, and then the kind of animal side breaks through. And I think it's movements that are able to exploit that are then able to kind of capture those institutions, and they will always be vulnerable to that. And so I think that's why we have to learn from those past experiences of, you know, where authoritarian urges have kind of taken over our best institutions. But we forget, and then, you know, and then we also forget about people who exploit these institutions. So, you know, Jimmy Savile, the Catholic Church, all of the child abuse stuff, where we've had all of these. How do we learn these lessons? How do we put in safeguards to protect these institutions from being groomed and being captured by people with a very particular sexual human urge? And as soon as those things are written, they're forgotten. You know, people say, okay, we understand that in relation to the Catholic Church, we understand it in relation to Me Too, and then 2 years later they're saying women who raise safeguarding concerns are TERFs and witches and they should be cast out. And I think, you know, the extent to which gender ideology has been used to undermine safeguarding is probably the most concerning thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because so many of these principles, not just sort of, well, we on the one hand you have these liberties, these are, you know, the presumption of innocence, for example, as well as freedom of speech, and then it needs to be these things are self-evidently powerful and important principles, but then so are the flip side of that. On the one hand, perhaps safeguarding versus sometimes the presumption of innocence. Sometimes those things can clash, and also arguably the need to protect against the development of hateful ideas, and the social sort of need to suppress that development, perhaps through limitation on freedom of speech. I know that I don't know if perhaps this is just sort of a society goes in waves throughout, you know, all these different debates, but I do know that the gay baker case in the US with the Christian man who didn't want to create a wedding cake for a gay couple. I noticed even years ago, actually, that when this news story would pop up, even on LGBT websites, gay people, and I counted myself among them, would express sort of you know, concern with the very fact that this man was being like, you know, leave him alone. You know, if he wants to be homophobic, let him be homophobic. And now it seems like sometimes that there are institutions and pressure groups that enjoy and perhaps sort of, you know, run on claiming to be able to speak on behalf of entire groups of people, when, you know, all these issues are so nuanced, and most people, even people who belong to these groups, the groups on behalf of which they purport to speak, recognize the nuance in these issues. And I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that thing of, you know, who do you feel sympathy for when they're cancelled, or you know, the you know, I think that the principle of the gay cakes case, and the gay cakes case in the UK, was about whether the baker should be allowed to refuse to produce a cake which had a message on it. So it was about compelled, it wasn't just about serving someone, it was about compelled speech. So they were asked to produce a cake that said, I support gay marriage, and they were a religious baker, and they said, well, I don't support gay marriage, so can you get your cake somewhere else? And this case has gone on and on through the courts. And you know, I think you're right. And I think, you know, probably when I wasn't paying very much attention to it, I would have decided that the homophobic baker was on the wrong side of history. But now I think it's important to, yeah, to protect his right to be homophobic in his, you know, to decide not to support gay marriage, and to win those battles through winning hearts and minds, and through winning you know, rational debate, rather than by imposing them on people. And so, you know, it's kind of more important that you have a society where people who have different beliefs can get along together, rather than where you have a society where everyone agrees with the same thing. So I think that's partly why we've ended up with kind of strange bedfellows on different sides of this debate. But I don't think we should be afraid of thinking that, you know, freedom of speech and freedom of belief are really, really fundamental, and that's going to mean you know, people you don't agree with. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yes. Yeah, so the final question, because I know we're past 7 o'clock. So this is Sophie's question. She asks, if we're going the route of challenging institutions, should we be focusing on more universal values like free speech as the most viable route to advancing feminist aims?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, I think if we don't have that, then everything else will fall. If we have that, then we can then have really interesting arguments and debates about everything else. But if we don't have that, we're screwed.
Okay, so I think we will call it there, and let Maya enjoy the rest of her evening. Thank you so much for joining us, Maya. That was a really interesting talk, and also thank you, obviously, for the audience for joining in and giving us your questions. We really appreciate it. Finally, let me say again a massive thanks to Object for letting us use their Zoom platform, and particularly to Mary from Object, who's been giving us tech support behind the scenes. Thank you also to Eve for creating the amazing posters and graphics for this series. So we're super grateful to all of those, all the women who have joined forces to make this happen. Now I'm just going to pass on to Sophie, who's going to say a word about donations and next week.
Yeah, and you can hear me all right, everyone? Is it coming through okay? Great, okay. Well, this is usually the part where we ask you to give us money. And lots of you have already given us money in the last couple of weeks, and you've been incredibly generous, and it's been brilliant. So I think this week we're going to ask you, if you can, not to give money to us, but to give your money to a couple of other really worthy causes. First and foremost among which is, of course, Sex Matters, Maya's organisation. There are also some brilliant volunteering opportunities with Sex Matters, and you can and whatever you do, you should sign up to the mailing list to kind of stay informed, but also please give them your money if you have any spare. And then if you happen to have any left over after that, which of course you may not, but we hope you will, then we just wanted to say a word in support of Raquel Rosario Sanchez, who is currently running a crowdfunding scheme for a really, really important legal case against the University of Bristol, where she's a PhD student. I imagine most of you will know Raquel's story, but if not, briefly, she's been harassed and bullied by students at her university for years. The university have enabled that by not following their own procedures, and right now she's trying to hold them to account to make sure that doesn't happen to any students in the future. So obviously it's an excellent cause. We've retweeted the link to her crowdfunding page, so it should be relatively near the top of our page, and then if you find her on Twitter, it's right near the top of hers as well. So if you feel like you can do that, then that would be fantastic. I think the only other thing I have to say is thank you for bearing with us with all the technical issues, especially if you came, especially if you're watching along on the YouTube live stream, which I know we've had a few issues with that tonight. So thank you so much for persisting and making it. And if you miss some of it, don't worry. It's all been recorded, and we'll be putting it up on YouTube really, really soon. So you haven't missed out on anything, I promise.
And we'll make the slides available.
Oh, that's great. Okay. And Joe Phoenix's slides from last week should be up soon as well. So you'll be able to catch up with that as well. So all that remains is to say, please tune in again next week at the same time. And the brilliant Rachel Ara will be talking on feminist art and the politics of no platforming within that space. So thank you so much again for coming, everyone. And I think, Mary, we're going to call it there if you could end the Zoom.